this guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
You know, Canada, once a refuge for the rugged individual, we would be hard-pressed to make a case for that for Canada today. Since 1850, urbanization has swept the country, practically inverting the population of urban dwellers and rural residents. Today, nearly 80% of Canadians live in an urban area. As noted by one of the members opposite, Canada has changed. Although he is not entirely wrong in his assessment, in this process of change, many aspects of this country have been improved. However, blind nostalgia does us no favors. Yet as different as the country looks today compared to the one the traveler would have found in 1850, this does not mean that all traces of this old Canada ought to be erased. For those Canadians and First Nations who live in remote areas or participate in the outdoor way of life, their lived reality is a different one than those who keep the most populated or live in the most populated parts of our nation. As you can imagine, life in places like Pond Inlet in Nunavut, Ignace, Ontario, Sept-Îles, Quebec, Corner Brook, Newfoundland, or Prince Rupert, British Columbia, resemble nothing of the urban experience in downtown Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal. One should note that the prevalence of firearms licenses per 100 people is the highest in Yukon, for a rate of 19.17%. 1 in 5 Yukoners has a firearm, compared to the national average of just under 6%, thus indicating a wide swing in licenseship ownership in certain parts of the country. It may come as a surprise to the members opposite, but those participating in the hunting lifestyle are surprisingly diverse. The hunters of today are not your trappers of the early fur trade, which, by the way, is an essential part of our history and the basis of modern commerce in our nation. Hunting is a genuine family-oriented activity enjoyed by those of all creeds and ethnic backgrounds, where the wisdom of past generations is passed down to the new. I am here at committee today because with Bill C-21, the federal government has, whether it wants to admit it or not, basically said to hunters that your way of life is going to be no more. Guns are not weapons of war, as some politicians would like to have you believe, but an essential harvesting tool used for hunters to feed their families. It provides food security in our northern and remote communities, and I've heard scoffing and other rhetoric from other politicians indicating that this way of life is not even needed in a modern Canada. And I take particular offense in the carelessness and what appears to be the carelessness of the drafting of not only this bill, but of the proposed amendments that are before it. It is clear to me that Bill 71 is not based on science at all. It is not based on any evidence at all, but it is a simple political decision, and the problem with this is it tarnishes the time-honored traditions of firearms owners and sport shooters in this country, hunters included. It tarnishes the reputations, sullies the reputations of these good, honest, law-abiding, patriotic Canadians. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a proponent of naturalism, once stated that the only true freedom was found in nature alone, and that one must remain close to nature and its inherent liberty and equality. It is Rousseau that created the concept of the social contract, to counter the loss of freedom brought on by man's move away from the inherent freedom of nature. He believed that a man's participation in what he called unnatural collective activities infringed on his liberty, and as such, a bargain called the social contract had to be struck. The purpose of the social contract, made by sacrificing some individual freedom for state protection and cooperative benefits, lays out the obligations of government towards its subjects. Although we can argue about what these consist of, John Locke, another contributor to the theory of social contracts, explained it best when he said, "Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." Bill C-21 is a piece of legislation that breaks this social contract. Beyond the obvious point of liberty, it also infringes on both the right to possess guns themselves and a right to personal health and freedom. This may all seem academic, but fear not. I'm about to present some real-world concrete examples of what the infringement on the Canadian social contract means for the hunting community. Canadians have a reasonable right to own their possessions. One of the foundational pillars of the social contract, private property lies at the heart of many democratic systems. We know this to be true, as even though it is not enshrined in our legislation, that Canada is a signatory to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes that everyone has the right to own property, and provides that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his or her property. Arbitrary is an important word in this context, as Bill C-21 does exactly this. Not only is the classification of firearms in Amendment G4 and G46E arbitrary, but the lack of buyback or any provisions hinting at a buyback is proof of how little the government regards the concept of property rights. It is also striking to me that many of these guns included on the list of firearms are not solely semi-automatic as intended by the legislation and as advertised by the Prime Minister, but many are bolt-action rifles and shotguns, including the likes of the Winchester Model 54, Weatherby Mark V, the Kimber 89 African, and the Montana Rifle 1999. These are not military rifles that later became popular as hunting arms, but were designed explicitly for the purpose of hunting. A separate point I would like to make is the availability of both firearms and ammunition in northern communities. Access to firearms in northern communities is already limited and can be hard to come by in the make and model desired by hunters. Notwithstanding COVID supply chain issues, there has been a long-running difficulty in supplying the North with these items. In fact, Canada Post will no longer ship ammunition, and now with this ban replacing with this proposed ban, if it comes into force, replacing these banned firearms will be difficult for First Nations and Inuit in an already stretched market. By instituting such a wide-ranging ban, the Liberal government will make it difficult for these hunters to replace their firearms. Yet these people are the likeliest to perform sustenance hunting, endangering a critical method of ensuring food security in a harsh environment where groceries come at an irregular pace and with high prices. Lastly, I would like to focus on how our new gun laws will affect the tourism sector. Hunters inbound from abroad, especially the United States, contribute significantly to our hunting sector and keep our lodges and outfitters busy. And I might add that for the last 2 years of COVID-19, guides and outfitters and lodges have been some of the most hardest hit in the tourism sector. And I can tell you, as a hunter, that these tourists often prefer to take their own firearms, as not only will they be more ergonomic, but also have the added safety benefit of the hunter knowing his own firearm. By depriving foreign tourists of their reasonable hunting rifles, as proposed, it will happen, I can assure you it will happen, with the evergreening clause, as it's referred to, and with the schedule list of firearms. This will result in just yet another blow to the guides and outfitters and lodges across our country. As for the health component of the social contract, it is clearly violated by Bill C-21. Those closest to the natural world, for example, are rural Canadians and hunters, are the most impacted by the loss of liberty engendered by an increasingly urbanized society. They are also the ones most vulnerable to the loss of their physical well-being due to the prohibition of their tools and property. As previously mentioned, this bill may in fact affect food security, yet there is also a physical health component to firearms debate that is not often discussed, that of workers in remote areas. In some parts of our country and in some industries, firearms are vital to one's physical safety. In this scenario, firearms are actually used for self-defense. Tour operators operating in the north need to ensure that their guests are protected from polar bears and other wildlife. They have a duty of care to protect their guests. When beekeepers go out into remote areas to collect honey from their hives, it is not uncommon at all for a beekeeper to be caught unaware by a lingering bear. This is a completely different scenario than a hunter who is walking through the woods carrying his or her firearm, ready at a moment's notice to pursue the hunt. These are people who find themselves in a defensive position. These are people who need to be able to react and respond quickly because their primary focus and objective while they're working is not the same as the primary focus of somebody who is hunting. And I can tell you, without any hesitation whatsoever, that the ability to have a shotgun that would be caught up in the evergreening clause or on the schedule that is proposed in these amendments to Bill C-21 would take a vast number of firearms away from people who are just trying to defend themselves. I know beekeepers who carry with them a Tavor because it is compact, it has 5 rounds, it's chambered in .308, and it will stop a bear. And now this beekeeper is going to have his property rendered valueless, and he has to go and search for another firearm or shotgun that would have the similar capabilities of the Tavor, not knowing if Section G4 of this proposed legislation, of the amendment coming through, would in fact eventually get that new firearm caught up in the prohibited list. This violates the social contract between Canadians and their government, and it also potentially harms the health and safety and well-being of Canadians. I remember very vividly, because I have worked most of my life prior to coming to Parliament in the outdoor industry. I was a conservation officer for the province of Alberta, and I was a national park warden in Jasper National Park. I'm also a hunter. There are numerous reasons why people would have a semi-automatic firearm. Anybody working in the forestry industry, anybody who's done the job of timber cruising, where you're going down a cut line, determining whether or not a cut block is going to be productive or not for your forestry company, would carry with them a shotgun likely advertised by the manufacturer as a defender. It could be semi-automatic, it could be pump action, it would likely have a pistol grip, and it would likely be polymer plastic, or made out of polymer, and it would be black. And it would look, to the untrained eye, like a scary gun. But it is the firearm that would be best used and best positioned to provide the safety benefit to somebody's son or daughter, to somebody's brother or sister, to somebody's mom or dad who's working in the outdoor environment in a situation where they can be put at risk. Not to mention all of the hunters in this land. Not everybody who hunts with a firearm. There are bow hunters. And if you don't have the knowledge or experience of what it's like to sit in a tree stand and call or bugle for an elk or for a buck or for a bull moose, what you are also doing in that act is letting every predator in the woods know that you are there as well. It is not unreasonable at all for a bow hunter to have a safety firearm with them. It needs to be small and compact, otherwise it does not work in that scenario. I can tell you numerous firearms that are newly added to the list in the proposed amendments will now render firearms that were bought specifically for the purpose of personal protection by people who, either through their work or through their enjoyment of hunting, will now have their property rendered useless, if not worthless.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I haven't heard a question.
Mr. Van Bynen on a...
Yeah. We have witnesses here, and I haven't heard a question yet. I'm wondering if we could...
I haven't heard a question by Mr. Van Bynen either.
Mr.
If he wants the floor, he can ask for it.
I haven't, Mr. Chair, I haven't asked for time to ask questions, but I'm here to hear, have the benefit of the witnesses' information, particularly from a technical point of view. And if and when I do have a question, I will let the chair know.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. However, there's no obligation of the member to ask questions. The officials are here to provide answers if asked, but the member may certainly carry on his debate. It is related to G4, I believe, and please carry on.
Thank you, Chair. So before I get to the officials for questions, I would like to remind my colleagues opposite the two things that are often forgotten when talking about firearm bans. The opportunity cost expended when these excessive and ineffective gun control measures are put in place, and what little risk actually exists of being victimized by a law-abiding firearms owner. I asked my colleagues what kind of cost-benefit analysis has been conducted for this project, for the cost of the buyback, the last of which was not even completed yet, a host of measures could be purchased to actually improve public safety, as my colleague Mr. Zimmer has said. With the high estimate, or even just with a medium-term estimate of $5 billion, which is what the Fraser Institute said for the last buyback before we even included new firearms through the proposed amendments, we could make quick work of many outstanding needs. At a cost of $3 million US dollars, that is how much the Grand Caymans just spent this year, $3 million for a shipping container scanning system. Modern shipping container scanning system. $3 million. It doesn't just find firearms. It finds all contraband, including drugs. And in a nation of Canada where I believe we have 119 ports of entry, we convert 5 million Canadian dollars into US dollars. We could literally buy 10 of these scanning devices for every port of entry, rather than buying $5 million worth of firearms from law-abiding Canadians. Now you tell me, and to the Canadians who are watching, you tell me which is likely to have a larger impact on public safety. Being able to scan virtually every vehicle and every container that comes into our country, or taking property away that's sitting there idly in the lockers and vaults of everyday Canadians? I already know what the answer to that question is. Only 1% of containers currently passing through our ports of entry are scanned. That's it. 1%. We obviously need to improve this if we're going to stem the tide of illegal firearms moving north from our southern neighbor. Speaking of which, a large number of Border Patrol officers could also be hired to ensure a further reduction in cross-border smuggling. After all, most of the guns used in urban gang shootings are smuggled in illegally at a staggering 85%, according to the Toronto Police. On the social services side of the things, we could surely throw in that $875 million that the Liberals promised in their last election campaign for mental health, which I would argue is probably at the root for most of the gun violence that we have in this country, if somebody from the law-abiding community were to do this. So, how many times could we fund the mental health strategy that the Liberals haven't allocated a single dollar for, instead of potentially...
Point of order,
and I don't
again,
even
Mr. Chair, point of order. We're looking for relevance
Mr. Van
here.
Boynen, on a point of order.
I'm looking for relevance here with respect to the technical expertise that we've invited to this meeting. Still haven't heard any.
Thank you, Mr. Van Boynen. But again, the technical expertise is there for the member to call upon if needed. But as long as the remarks are addressed to the bill and particularly to the motion, he's free to speak on whatever he likes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Alternatively, if not invested in mental health, if not invested in purchasing scanners at our ports of entry, it would be surprising for Canadians to know that in Miramichi, New Brunswick, only 10% of the required background checks are conducted in the renewal or the application of a current firearms license, because it's not properly or adequately funded, Mr. Chair. So, these are all tangible, concrete things that would actually improve safety for Canadians, public safety for our country, with $5 billion worth of funding, which is what the Fraser Institute estimates what it would cost if the Government of Canada were to provide compensation to firearms owners should Bill C-21 and its amendments come to pass. On the perception of legal gun ownership contributing to crime, we know that simply isn't true. Under this government, the prevalence of violent crime is up 32%, and there is a fear that will only get worse. In fact, the banning of certain firearms seems to be a political exercise, and there is a legitimate fear that the crime issue will be used by the government to ban even more lawful firearms. As we see from some of the amendments brought forth by the government, the list is not simply semi-automatics, but a wide swath of firearms. Despite the fact that handguns are used to commit the vast majority of violent crimes in Canada, long guns and shotguns are bearing the full brunt of this government's policies. Furthermore, firearm-related violent crime typically represents less than 3% of police-reported violent crime in Canada, a country where individuals own more than 20 million guns. Canadians have little to fear from law-abiding gun owners. Ironically, in the UK, during 2019-2020, nearly 16,000 knife crimes were committed in a nation with strict gun control. I will add that in comparison to Canada, the UK reported 33% more robberies, 22% more assaults, 30% more homicides, and 28% more hate crimes. Ironically, many of the European nations that are held up against Canada due to their tight gun control, including France, the UK, Belgium, Greece, and Sweden, fare much worse in their crime rate, and Germany is also comparable. Canada is not the United States, and it is not healthy to import their cultural issues for political gains. Every loss of life is a tragedy, but it does have to be put in perspective. A 2011 study from McMaster University found no significant association between gun laws passed and firearm homicide rates in Canada from 1974 to 2008, proving that the introduction of such laws within the Canadian context has been nothing more than a political exercise. While homicide-related deaths get much more of the attention within the context of firearms being used, many of the excess deaths are tied to suicides, yet this is still a very minimal number. On the accident front, firearms have also attracted unwanted attention, yet accidents account for 0.3% of total accident incidents, ranking well below 37% for transportation vis-a-vis car accidents, 18% for people falling off roofs or falling from distances, and 11% for poisoning. Yet nobody here is arguing that we should not drive cars. We are focusing so much time, so much effort, and so much money on something that is so insignificant, it's not even funny. To recapitulate, this is a bad law as it breaks the social contract that Canadians have struck with their government, come to a great expense, and will come to a great expense potentially for taxpayers of Canada, and fails to improve public safety. Now that I've done my rant, Mr. Van Bynen, you'll be very happy to know that I have some questions. My questions for our panel of experts is there any province or territory in Canada that prohibits a hunter from hunting with a firearm in its provincial wildlife rules, laws, or regulations, prevents a hunter from hunting with a firearm that has a force of over 10,000 joules?
Not that I'm aware of.
So until this order in council and until these proposed amendments were made, it was completely legal to hunt in Canada with a rifle that produced a force of greater than 10,000 joules, correct?
If that firearm had been non-restricted prior to May 1st, 2020, or was not previously restricted in the classification regulations, then it would have been legal to use those firearms for hunting.
Weatherby, on its site, because Weatherby also makes much of its own ammunition, claims that the 460 and other large ammunition, powerful ammunition, I will call it, even if it's in 30 cal, says explicitly in their marketing that this ammunition is only good for animals up to about 2,000 pounds. Is there any animals in North America that are hunted lawfully, harvested lawfully, that are greater than 2,000 pounds?
Thank you for the question. I think this is outside of the scope that we as officials can provide answers to.
So can I ask the officials, had they conducted any research? Had they met with any hunting groups? Had they met with any northern hunting groups, for example, Inuit who hunt bowhead whales, narwhals, and belugas? Or anybody in the Yukon or northern Alberta where bison hunting is legal? Has the department reached out to any of these organizations to find out the impact of limiting hunting to calibers that produce joules less than 10,000 and what that might do for those people who are hunting large terrestrial or aquatic animals?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chang on a point of order.
Mr. Chair, the officials are here to answer technical questions, not about animals in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Chang, and the point is taken. Certainly, our officials are today here to answer technical questions on the bill, on the amendment before us. So I would certainly encourage the member to.
I simply asked, Mr. Chair, if any of our technical experts are aware of any information that the Government of Canada has in consultations with anybody who hunts large terrestrial or aquatic mammals in this country, because it has a bearing to do on the 10,000 joules, which is part of the order in council from a few years ago and is wrapped up specifically in Bill C-21. It was perfectly legal, as the witnesses have already said, that hunting with those calibers and that ammunition was perfectly legal, and now it is not. And I'm wondering if anybody knows what the impact of that is going to be on the First Nations communities of this country or other people who hunt large terrestrial land animals. That's a perfectly legitimate question, Mr. Chair. I would like to know the answer if the officials have it.
Thank you for the question. In terms of the proposed amendments, in terms of your question with regards to 10,000 joules, those are already prohibited through the OIC. Therefore, there is no change of what is prohibited if this motion were to pass.
My question was actually, does the department have any information, any information that it can table with this committee of any scientific rationale for the purpose of hunting why a 10,000 joule rifle should not be allowed to be used in Canada?
So,
has any consultation been done with any of the groups that might be infected?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
And I just want to know if that information exists or if this is just an arbitrary
Mr.
decision.
Nur Mohammed on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I mean, it is clear that Mr. Calkins is aware of what happens when you shoot something with 10,000 joules. You obliterate the animal. You know that belugas and narwhals are hunted using regular hunting firearms, not 10,000 joule things, and bowhead whales are used using explosive devices. We are asking questions here of witnesses that is outside the scope of their expertise. They do not represent the entirety of the Government of Canada. I would really encourage you, Mr. Chair, to ensure that the questions are focused on the areas of expertise with which these witnesses have presented themselves and have been willing to offer their time.
I'm at a bit of debate there, but I take your point. The officials are really here. They can't comment on policy and on conjecture about what's going on behind the scenes, I believe. Anyway, carry on, Mr.
Well, as Mr.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Madame Michaud on a point of order.
Je pense que les questions de Monsieur Calkins.
I believe that Mr. Calkins' questions are relevant. And if the officials here cannot answer them, maybe we could ask the questions to the proponent of the amendment. If I was to propose this amendment, I would have to explain what is my basis. For example, 10,000 joules. So maybe Mr. Chang could answer the question, because I have the same questions. And normally we ask those questions to the proponent of the amendment. So I will leave Mr. Calkins go ahead, but I believe that the government MPs maybe could answer those questions.
To Madame Michaud's point, Mr. Chang is not a witness. These are certainly matters that can be raised and asked in debate, absolutely. And perhaps at some point Mr. Chang would care to respond in debate as well. I'm sorry, there was another point of order?
Yeah,
Is that the same point of order?
I would just support Ms. Michaud's proposal, the proponent, to provide their opinion and evidence to answer that question. Thank you.
Well, once again, Mr. Chang is not a witness before this committee. He's a member of it, and it's not appropriate to, part of the process. Anyway, Mr. Calkin, if you please, carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I take it that the department doesn't have any information to share with the committee on any consultations that it's had with any of the hunting groups in Canada about whether or not the 10,000 joule limit is actually reasonable or not. Mr. Smith, would a 460 Weatherby, would any rifle chambered in a 460 Weatherby be prohibited as a result of the changes that are being proposed and going back to the order in council?
The 460 Weatherby is a rifle made for a variety of purposes related to hunting. It is available in high energy calibers, those which exceed 10,000 joules largely for hunting large African game. The rifle is also available in smaller calibers, which are typical of what would be used by hunters.
Okay,
in
so my
Canada.
question for you is very technical then, because if we're taking a look at, say, a Ruger, let's take a look at the number. Well, I believe it's the number one. Many of these firearms have interchangeable barrels. Would you agree with my assessment?
Some firearms are modular. However, neither the Weatherby Mark V nor the Ruger number 1 are modular. Changing the barrels on either of those firearms is a major gunsmithing undertaking.
Let's use an example of a gun that does have a modular capacity that is currently prohibited. What would happen if somebody had one of those hunting firearms? They had a barrel that was for a 460, but they also had a 30-06 barrel for it. How would the law interpret that?
Our position or our interpretation of it is that in order for a firearm to be affected by the 10,000 joule provision, the firearm has to actually be chambered for that particular caliber.
But you're not banning the barrel, you're banning the entire firearm. Mr. Smith, explain to me how the law works. I have a similar question for you when it comes back to the G4, but so I'm simply talking about the barrel, not the rest of the firearm. If the barrel is changeable from a 30-06 to a 460 Weatherby,
the barrels for rifles in general are not regulated. So to be in possession of a barrel chambered for any caliber, be it one over 10,000 joules or not, is not regulated. The barrels are not a regulated commodity for rifles.
But yet the barrel is the one that's responsible for the caliber that it can shoot, correct?
It's one of the characteristics responsible, but also the bolt itself has to be compatible with the caliber. So the bolt face can change from one caliber to another.
Well, I would assume that a rifle manufacturer wouldn't provide barrels or wouldn't manufacture barrels for which the bolt was incompatible. That would make no sense. Would you agree?
Well, I agree in part. I understand your point. But the point I'm making is that if you change, say, a Weatherby Mark V rifle from a caliber, a smaller caliber, say, 338 Weatherby, to be chambered for 460 Weatherby, which is over 10,000 joules, it's necessary to change the barrel and the bolt.
In that particular example.
In that particular firearm.
But there are other firearms where you could change the barrels and get over the 10,000 joules, is there not?
It depends, again, on the exact circumstances, because there are...
So let's just say, hypothetically, what does the law do to an owner of a gun, doesn't matter the make or model, the owner of a gun who has the ability to change the barrel to a caliber that can exceed 10,000 joules and to a barrel that doesn't exceed 10,000 joules, what happens to that individual's firearm?
In my experience, the firearm would be prohibited only if it is actually, the rifle is actually chambered for the high energy caliber, and there's a parallel to that exists in law today. There's a provision under the restricted firearms definition for firearms which become restricted if they have a barrel length under 470 millimeters, plus other technical considerations. And the firearm is considered restricted only if it has the short barrel on and not if it doesn't. So that's an exact parallel to the situation you're describing. And the way the courts have dealt with that is to consider what the firearm actually has mounted in order to assess its classification. So I don't think there's anything in particular for an owner of the type that you described who happens to have a spare barrel in a caliber that's over 10,000 joules.
What are you going to do when Weatherby loads their 460 Weatherby to produce 9,999 joules?
The way the definition is framed in Section 95 speaks to capable rather than actual, and so downloading the caliber would not change things. The firearm is still capable of receiving a standard 460 Weatherby, and therefore would continue to be prohibited.
Is every semi-automatic rifle that's capable of accepting a legal magazine capable of accepting an illegal magazine if it's manufactured for that rifle?
Yes.
So that would mean that G4 means every semi-automatic rifle with a
Mr.
centerfire
Cochran, please let
cartridge in
the
this
witness
country
answer.
is now illegal?
No, I would not agree with that because the magazine capacity
Just cut in.
is not linked to the
Mr.
classification
Cochran.
of the firearm.
Oh, no, it's a friendly conversation, Mr.
I understand, but we're not hearing the answers that the witness is giving. So
Okay.
I encourage the lively debate, but I would like to hear the
Yeah,
answers.
that's fair. Thank you, Chair.
Under the present law, magazines and firearms are classified independently. We have magazine regulations which determine which magazines are lawful and which are not. And we also have.
I understand that. I understand that, Mr. Smith. You're right. I agree with you. I'm not disputing that. But the evergreening clause in G4 actually doesn't speak to magazines. It speaks to the rifle, and if the rifle is capable.
That's correct. That would be a change in the way things operate with respect to that.
Oh, yeah,
particular
that's a big
provision.
change, Mr. Smith. Yeah, I
And
would agree
so-
with you.
And so firearms which meet the criteria of that definition. So the firearm in question must be a rifle or shotgun, must be semi-automatic, must have a detachable magazine, and the capacity of that magazine must exceed 5 shots.
No, that's not what the law says, Mr. Smith. It doesn't say that the magazine has to have more. It says it's capable of receiving a magazine that contains more than 5. That is a capability issue, not a definition of how many shots are legal in a magazine. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. It is, you're correct in that assessment, that if the firearm is capable of accepting a magazine that exceeds 5 shots, then it would fall into the prohibited category. That's limited somewhat by language that limits
Do you
it.
need a license to buy a magazine?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
The witness was in the middle of
Mr. Nurmahambad on a point of order.
the witness was literally in the middle of explaining what the caveat was, and Mr. Calkins cut him off. Can we please have the witness finish the answer so we can hear what he was trying to say?
On the same point of order?
Yes, can we please have the government across the way keep interrupting our questioning?
That's
And we'll
not
get-
that's
and
not
we'll
the
get
same
to
point
the
of order.
answers.
So I would certainly appreciate the witness being able to finish his answer.
Yes, I was just looking at the actual definition there, and it does not actually use the word capable. It uses the word designed. So your point is partially correct in that the classification of the rifle or the shotgun is influenced by the kind of magazines it's designed to accept. But but the use of the word capable is somewhat broader than that.
Could I clarify the drafting of the provision as well?
Go
There
ahead.
seems to be a misunderstanding that the design to accept a cartridge magazine means that it is limited, that it applies to any cartridge magazine over 5. And the phrasing of the provision says of more than 5 cartridges, and then what follows afterwards says of the type for which the firearm was originally designed. And the design to accept clause was drafted to refer to the magazine that was originally designed for that firearm by the manufacturer.
Well, with all due respect, Madam Clerk, the second word in that clause is a firearm. That is a rifle or shotgun. It's not talking explicitly about magazines.
So it says a firearm that is a rifle or shotgun. Then it goes on to say that is capable of discharging semi-automatic ammunition, discharging centerfire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner. And then the third category, the third requirement, is that that firearm is designed to accept a detachable magazine with a capacity of greater than 5 magazines. And then with the final clause,
Okay.
of the type for which the firearm was originally designed. So
So-
that means that the
what-
magazine cartridge was, the firearm and the magazine cartridge were designed together by the manufacturer. And so compatibility with the third-party manufacturer magazine beyond the original design intent of that firearm would not render that firearm prohibited. That firearm would not be prohibited according to this definition. And what this does,
I
it
don't-
establishes, I haven't finished, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
What this would do is that it establishes like a stable classification of these firearms and that it's unaffected by third-party manufacturers of magazine cartridge magazines.
With the greatest of respect, Madam Clerk, most of the firearms that are capable of receiving a magazine are designed. There is nothing different about the feeding mechanism of a magazine when it feeds a round of ammunition into the chamber. There is nothing different about it, whether it can hold 5 rounds or 7 rounds. There is no requirement under Canadian law at all to have a license. Anybody can go into any store and purchase a magazine for a rifle without a firearms license. Am I correct?
You're correct.
So, what this means, in my interpretation, even though I appreciate your clarification, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the fact that we don't have any restrictions on magazines at all in this country, other than if they're going to be used, they have to be pinned to 5. You would agree with that statement, right?
I agree with that statement.
But that's not what this, I know that's what you're trying to say, this says. The fear that it's caused in the firearms community is that because there is no restriction on magazines, you do not need a license to buy a magazine. Virtually every single manufacturer of the firearms that we talked about in semi-automatic with detachable magazines also makes magazines for the same make, the same model. They might be sold in different countries, but they make detachable magazines that are designed to go into that gun. That's what they're designed to do. So they meet your criteria of designed to accept a detachable magazine. So why would we put such ambiguous language in the legislation as to create this problem? Because I simply don't trust. I don't trust the wording in this clause at all. Neither does any other hunter in this country that has a semi-automatic firearm.
So my response to this would be that this is a motion that's put before the committee. The committee and Parliament has the ability to modify the wording of the proposed definition. This can be something that would be passed by Parliament, debated by Parliament, and should a amendment to the definition be agreed upon by Parliament, then that is a decision that could be made at the political level.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Getting back to hunting, has the department had any consultations with any provincial or territorial ministry responsible for hunting? Because, I'll frame the context here for you. I'm an Albertan, so I'll tell you about what the laws are in Alberta, but I know what they are in Saskatchewan and Ontario and other places. For example, the hunting management unit that's just east of Ottawa right now has a 2-week shotgun hunting period for deer. The provincial regulations clearly say that you can use a semi-automatic shotgun to do so. It doesn't indicate any way, shape, or form whether or not that firearm can have a pistol grip or appear in any way, shape, or form to be a scary type of firearm. So it can be a shotgun that looks like a Defender, the one that I was referencing in my introductory remarks. So has the department consulted with any of the provincial ministries responsible for hunting about how many hunters in their province or territory use those types of firearms, which are now going to be prohibited should this law come to pass?
Thank you for your question. The proposed amendments under G4 do not contain any criteria related to pistol grips, the color of the firearm.
Okay.
I can repeat the criteria, but it has nothing to do with those criteria that you have outlined in your question.
And I could add that even though there's provincial and territorial legislation that refer to different types of firearms, whether they're non-restricted, restricted, or prohibited, once these firearms become prohibited, they will no longer be able to be used or possessed by Canadians for any purpose.
On this list, and I know I'm jumping ahead to 46, but I would imagine that the items on 46 are there because of G4. There are a number of Benelli shotguns that are now going to be prohibited. And Benelli seems to be the only firearm that has a reverse list of exceptions in the schedule. Am I correct in that?
When the Benelli was prescribed as prohibited in the 1990s, there were firearms that were exempted from that definition, and that was a decision made at a political level to exempt these makes and models from the prohibition.
So when Benelli comes out with a new model or new variant of shotgun, we would need an act of Parliament in order to make it legal in Canada, because the Benellis that are legal are provided in a list of exemptions. Virtually every other Benelli that's not on that list is prohibited, correct?
Yes, that would be correct. If the list of exemptions in paragraph 7 of Schedule 1, which is the one that deals with the Benelli M1 and M3 shotguns, which I believe is the one you're referring to, that list is a closed list. So the firearm make and model must be explicitly named in the list in order for it to be exempted, and any new model that comes out would fall within the variant or modified version clause of para 7 and would be prohibited.
Even if it was, by all manner, if it appeared to be a bird hunting semi-automatic shotgun, it would be prohibited automatically because it's simply not on the list.
That's correct, and it's been that way since 1992.
The difference is it would require just a simple order in council in order to put it on the list before. Now it's going to require an act of Parliament in order to do that. Am I missing something, Mr. Smith?
No, that's consistent with my understanding as well.
Yes, that's correct. They will codify these into legislation.
So now, if you're a hunter that uses Benelli firearms, and you want the newest make and model of what Benelli has to offer to the marketplace, you would have to contact your local member of Parliament and ask for an amendment to the statutes of Canada in order to be able to purchase and acquire a modern or a new version of a Benelli turkey hunting gun.
Yes, as with any other prohibited firearm.
No, that's not true. Because items used to be able to be put on the schedule through an order in council. Now it requires an act of Parliament.
So let me rephrase. Yes, you would have to ask because it would be in statute and codified in the criminal code as a prohibited firearm rather than a delegated authority through the GIC through regulations, which there are now and which some of them have been since the 1990s.
So now that this is moved to codified in the statute, rather than just being something that can be done through an order in council, what are the chances, should this law come to pass and codify in legislation all of these Benellis, what are the chances of any new Benelli shotguns actually getting into the marketplace in Canada?
So I don't think that we can speculate on that, on what manufacturers would or would not do and how they would enter the market. If my colleague has anything to add to that.
Do you think Benelli would have a legal case of being treated disproportionately?
I think we'd have to ask Benelli's counsel, but they would be prohibited from being imported into Canada.
I'll just add, though, it's not Benelli the manufacturer, right?
I understand.
So it's
They're
not
not the
Benelli
only-
the manufacturer.
Yeah.
It's variants of
Yeah, no, I
items
understand.
that are prohibited.
I understand.
Thank you.
Getting back to personal defense, I articulated in my opening remarks numerous scenarios where people who are in the outdoors who would currently not have to seek any permission to use their non-restricted shotguns or rifles, like a Tavor chambered in .308, is there anything in this legislation? Because, let's face it, if you have an employee that's working in a dangerous situation, you as an employer have a responsibility a responsibility to provide your employees with all of the safety equipment that's necessary for them to conduct their duties safely. We've seen this in the RCMP, as a matter of fact. The RCMP had lost a case for not providing the right equipment to their members. Is there any provision in the legislation or the proposed amendments that would allow people who work in dangerous industries where they're proximal to wildlife, where they're they've been charged with the protection of other people, is there any exemptions for them for any of the firearms that they currently use right now? Is there a permitting path? Is there a way for them to get an exemption so that they can continue to use the firearms for which they purchased for the purpose of personal protection? Or will they simply, their firearms that are now slated to go to the prohibited list, go to the prohibited list, too bad, so sad, go buy a different gun? What's the approach?
So what I can say, being from up north and having experienced this because I worked at a fly and fish and hunting camp, no, there's no specific right. There's no right in Canada. The law is well settled to a specific firearm. Once prohibited, there is no ability to use that for self-defense or any other purpose in the wild. What I can say is there are sometimes authorizations to carry that are provided through the Firearms Act or under the authority of the Firearms Act, and I could possibly turn to my colleague Rochelle and perhaps she can.
Thanks. So under the Firearms Act, there is a mechanism where individuals are allowed to carry or authorized to carry, where they're specifically authorized to carry restricted firearms and use them for either personal protection or for the course of their employment, is what exists right now. So for example, a security guard, a private security guard would have a an exemption for the reason of their employment. We also see sometimes for people that are, you mentioned in the north, in terms of for protecting from wildlife, they sometimes will carry more than one, maybe a handgun and a long gun, and restricted firearms can be used in those cases.
So basically what you're saying right now is certain firearms that people are using currently without having to ask for extra permission will be moved to a prohibited list, and the only way that they'll be able to continue to use them for personal protection, and I'm not talking about, of course, I'm not talking about somebody who would be an armored car driver or something like this. This is not the exception I'm talking about. I'm talking about the person who on a northern cruise ship gets off the ship and is charged with the responsibility, should a polar bear come and attack the crew or the guests, currently uses a .24 chambered in .308 or uses a shotgun that is now going to be prohibited, they would have to ask for permission from the local chief firearms officer. And a northern cruise ship would potentially stop in Atlantic Canada, maybe several provinces, each with its own chief firearms officer, might stop in northern Quebec, might stop in Nunavut, might stop in the Northwest Territories. Are you saying that that individual would need an ATC from each of those jurisdictions in order to do their job?
Thank you for the question. So in terms of the firearms, if the firearms they are currently using become prohibited, they won't be able to use them even with an ATC. An ATC applies for restricted firearms.
Only restricted.
However, so that would be the impact if the firearms that they are currently using are prohibited. That
If
would
it's
be the
prohibited,
impact.
it's now rendered useless for all of this regardless. They would still have to switch to either another non-restricted firearm or get a restricted firearm and then ask for an authorization to carry.
That is correct.
And they would need an authorization to carry from each jurisdiction, correct?
That's correct.
Correct, and that meets the objective of the government in banning all assault-style firearms that they had said in May 2020 and continue to say. So definitely, yes, any prohibited firearm would not be able to be used or possessed.
Okay. It's clear to me, Mr. Chair, that this law has a lot of problems for the practicability of people who live and work in rural and remote communities, and is going to make life less safe for hunters, for Indigenous people living in remote and rural areas, and for people who are employed not necessarily by an organization such as Brinks, but people who are self-employed, lodges and outfitters, and so on. So let's go to lodges and outfitters. As I said in my opening statement, lodges and outfitters, particularly hunting lodges, have basically been decimated by 2 years of COVID and closures and border restrictions. It's not your fault. I'm not blaming you. I'm not blaming any of you for anything, just asking for clarification. We know from talking to the folks in this industry, and whether it's a Canadian going to another country or others coming to Canada for the purpose of hunting, most will bring their own firearms with them or want to. 95% is the number. 95% of Canadians, of hunters prefer to take their own firearms with them. So that would be a Canadian going to the United States or Spain or wherever they happen to be hunting. It's no different for people who are coming here from other countries. If a firearm that was is now moved to the prohibited list, will that mean that any hunter from outside of Canada can no longer bring any of these prohibited firearms into the country for the purpose of short-term hunting at a guided or outfitted lodge or hunting excursion?
The classification of a firearm as prohibited applies to everybody within Canada, whether they are coming in from the U.S. to hunt as a form of tourism. It applies to any group that uses these firearms as part of a business. It applies to everybody in Canada. There are no exceptions.
So a hunter coming to Canada from another country, I guess it's their duty to know what the laws are if the laws change. How would that be handled by our border agents when somebody is en route to their destination for hunting?
So when an individual enters Canada, they are asked if they have any firearms, to declare any firearms. Again, I'm speaking a little bit outside of my lane. This would be my colleagues at the CBSA, at the Canadian Border Services Agency. But they are asked to declare any firearms that they have. And if they declare that they have any firearms, if they are prohibited, well, then the process that CBSA applies for prohibited firearms would apply.
So I can assume then, Mr. Chair, that numerous people who have come to hunt in Canada before, who brought with them in the past firearms that are hunting in nature or can be used for hunting, will be denied entry into Canada. And I am very concerned, Mr. Chair, about what that will do to our lodges and outfitters in this country, particularly those who offer northern hunting excursions for large moose, for example, in the Yukon, bison, and other large terrestrial mammals. So
Could we just clarify one point? It would be the firearm that would be prohibited from coming into
No, I
Canada
understand.
and not the individuals?
I understand, but 95% of people want to use their own guns, and if they're not allowed to bring their gun, they're not coming, ma'am. That's just the way it is. That will have definitely an adverse impact on our lodges and outfitters. So I guess my question to the officials that are here, does the department have any information about what the impact will be to our guides and outfitters across this country should all of the firearms that are currently on the list and scheduled to be prohibited, should this law come to pass? What will be the net economic consequence to our lodges and outfitters?
No, we do not have that information before us.
Mr. Calkin?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Look, I could keep going, but I'm pretty sure I see what the writing on the wall is here, that this is a political exercise, not an economic exercise, not a hunting exercise, not a public safety exercise. So I will give up my time until I think of some other questions that I'm sure I know what the answer is going to be.